All right, hello folks. I am Miss Winters and welcome to my unit plan, Deviance and Conformity, which is Unit 5 of Sociology 12, and it's actually titled Social Control, Deviant and Conformist Behavior. So what I'm going to do today is just go over the PowerPoint that I created for this unit, do some voiceovers for some things that might require a little bit more explanation. And you can just follow along as we go and do some of the activities, and I hope that you'll enjoy all the lessons that I have prepared. This is a really interesting and pretty fun and engaging unit, so I hope you enjoy. What do you know about deviance? Have you heard the term before? Can you give an example of it perhaps? Maybe you heard about it in a show or seen it in a movie, read about it in the newspaper, a book, whatever. So we'll just get you to write down in a brief list or paragraph what you already know about deviance, and we'll just get you to pause the lesson here while you do that, and then come back after. So now that you've done that, let's actually define deviance. So deviance is to deviate or depart from acceptable norms within a society. So some examples can be, in some cultures, having a lot of piercings or tattoos, picking your nose, as you can see pictured here, cheating on a test, or things like theft and murder. So we know what deviance is, so what would you think a deviant would be? Well, that might sound kind of self-explanatory. A deviant is a person who violates what is deemed socially acceptable behavior. But it's important to keep in mind that deviance can actually be good. So as you can see here, we have the famous RuPaul pictured, an example of drag queens and drag kings as well, sorry. They can be examples of good deviance. Life would be pretty boring if we all kind of follow the same status quo, social norms. So somebody who deviates from social norms can actually be positively showing their self-expression. So that is an important thing to remember, that not all deviance is negative. So deviance in crime. So crime is kind of a special category of deviance. There are varying levels of deviance. So think of it kind of like a scale. At the beginning of the scale, you have things kind of like what we just mentioned, like violating social norms, like picking your nose, or just kind of going against those kind of lower level social norms, all the way up to murder and crime. So crime can be defined, like I said, as a special category of deviance, and as you probably know, it is punishable by law. And it is important to remember that deviant acts can violate both social norms and laws, but deviant behavior can violate social norms and also not break any laws. So just think back to the previous example we just discussed about RuPaul and drag queens and drag kings and how they dress outside of social standards, which is deviant behavior. It is transgressing outside of social norms. It is deviating from social norms, but that's definitely not illegal. So it is important to remember that something can be deviant and not be a crime at the same time. So we'll just get you to pause here. Just think about some positive examples of deviance. Write them down if you think that will help you, or just keep them in your brain for later. So now that we've defined what a deviant is, what deviance is, what deviant behavior is, what's the opposite of that? Well, the opposite of that is called conformity. So that is when you obey the social norms in society and follow the law. And that is done through social control, which is how society regulates human behavior to maintain the accepted social order. Sanctions, those are an important piece of deviance and social control. So formal sanctions are legalized or official actions that enforce social control. And an example of that would be a traffic violation citation, prison time. Again, it can be something positive like academic awards or achievements that work to regulate that behavior, to reinforce it in terms of it being positive. So you do really well one of your classes and you win an award for highest mark in that class, you're more likely to want to do that again because you were sanctioned. You had like a positive interaction in that way. And informal sanctions, so those could be unwritten or unofficial ways to regulate or disrupt social norms. So some examples could be peer pressure, ridicule, making fun of somebody for doing something, and then that negative interaction can kind of control them to not do that again because they'll think back to this interaction. Or it can be positive, like a high five. You do something good, someone gives you a high five, you're likely to do that again because of the high five. And then on the other side of that, boycotts and protests. So if folks see something that they don't see as acceptable, they can boycott or protest in order to change that. A worksheet that I have attached to my unit plan, which is about whether or not something is a crime or a deviant act. So read the handout of all the acts that I have listed, and then using the information that we talked about earlier today, decide if the list of behavior is a crime or solely a deviant act. And that is where we will end lesson 1. So if that's all you're sticking around for today, you're free. But if not, we're going to continue on with our lesson 2. So this is more so about deviance in theory. So there are a multitude of theories that we use to couple with deviance in social control. So we'll start with our first one here, which is called anomie. And that is when an individual experiences social instability due to incompatible goals from social norms. So they fall victim to anomie. They experience isolation. So an example of this would be attempting to achieve the American dream, but failing. So achieving the American dream isn't always feasible for folks. It's not always something that is attainable for them, right? You get married, you have a good quote unquote job, you have kids, you live in this beautiful house with a white picket fence, that whole idea. But not everyone can or even wants to do that. So they feel isolated from the social norms because that is considered the norm. And then they kind of act out in a deviant way because they're feeling isolated. And then kind of in the same vein is labeling theory. That suggests that individuals' deviant behavior may be influenced by the way in which society classifies them. In other words, it could also be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So an example would be constantly calling somebody who might act a little differently than you a psycho. If they constantly hear that type of language being called that, they might start to see themselves that way and not understand how to act in any other way than how others perceive them. So deviance in different cultures, that's a really interesting thing to take a look at. So what is considered deviant in one place may not be considered deviant in another, and vice versa. Some examples that you can think of, maybe if you tuned into lesson 1, how we talked about how tattoos and piercings can be considered deviant. So it seems that they're becoming less deviant in kind of Western cultures, countries. But even maybe you have a friend or somebody whose family is from a different place or they're from a different culture, and tattoos and piercings are really considered deviant to them, whereas it might not be as much in your family. So it's interesting that you can live in the same spot, the same place, go to the same school as somebody else, and what they might consider deviant, you might not, and vice versa. So maybe just take this time to think of a few other examples, write those down or keep them in your head. It's interesting to kind of learn about different customs as well from different countries and see what's considered normal there. They might think that some of the things that we engage in here, like McDonald's, is just completely out of whack and considered deviant, even though it's something really normal here. So primary and secondary deviance. So primary deviance is initial act of deviance. And then secondary deviance is when the act continues to veer away from socially acceptable norms, and then that person who is committing the deviant act, they're labeled as whatever it is that they're doing. So an example is Susan. We're just using Susan as a random name here. She steals a candy bar from a store, so that's her primary deviance. That's her act. She did it perhaps on a whim, who knows. But then if Susan continues to steal more and more as she ages, she'll be labeled a thief, right? That's the secondary act of deviance, or the secondary deviance, I should say. So stigma, you folks might have heard this before. This word is often used a lot in kind of mental health campaigns, mental health awareness, but in terms of its connection to deviance, it can be considered a mark or a brand of disgrace that's connected to a specific circumstance, quality, or person. So stigma has been consistently used throughout time as a method of social control. So an example could be formerly incarcerated individuals who often face stigma when they re-enter society. So as you can see in the picture here, we've got one person who's kind of, they already look different than others. They're red and everybody else is yellow, but they're also boxed in because they have this mark or brand of disgrace. And this is a way to control folks because they can avoid something because they know that stigma follows that circumstance, right? Okay, so what we're gonna do now is watch the first 6 minutes of Megamind, which you can access on Netflix. And we're gonna keep in mind how this might demonstrate deviance in theory, and I specifically want you to think about how it might demonstrate labeling theory and anomie. So we'll get you to do that, pause the lesson, and go watch the first 6 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so Megamind, I think is a really fun movie, and it's actually the intro is a really good example of deviance in different theories, specifically labeling theory and anomie. Poor Megamind, he's sent down into the world at the same time as the super baby, Mr. Nice Guy. Um, and he tries so hard to fit in, but everyone just keeps labeling him as bad, and even though he's not trying to be bad, that's just how everyone perceives him. So then he kind of gets sick of it. He's been isolated. The anomie that's how anomie kind of comes in. He fails to achieve social norms. He's constantly being labeled as the bad guy, so he kind of comes to an epiphany and is like, you know what, if you guys think I'm going to be bad, then I'm going to be the baddest I can possibly be, because that's all you see me as, and that's all I see myself as. So that's an interesting example of deviance is through. So another interesting thing to think about in terms of deviance are the purposes of them, of deviance. So what do you think some purposes of deviance could be? Like we talked about how they're not always bad. So for example, like boycotts and protests. I'm thinking a lot of like climate change protests, protests for indigenous rights. When folks see something that they deem as socially unacceptable, they'll deviate from those norms to try and change them. So some purposes, like again, could be to change policy. So if we think back to before gay marriage was legal in Canada, that was considered deviant, right? But people didn't agree with that. So you can deviate outside of social norms to try and change something. So kind of putting that into fancier terms, there are kind of four main reasons, four main purposes of deviance. So that's to clarify cultural values, define social morality, unify society, and promote social change. And so those examples of boycotts and protests kind of fit underneath that umbrella. So now we'll get you to take a look at a case study. This study is called The Saints versus the Roughnecks, and it's attached to the unit plan here. I just want you to keep in mind how this article actually might connect to labeling theory. And then if you feel comfortable, kind of answer how you see labeling theory play out in your own mind or your own life and the lives around you, and to explain this a little bit and say why it demonstrates labeling theory. So we'll get you to work on that. The end of lesson 2. So if you're only sticking around for this lesson, we are about to move on to lesson 3. Okay, so we'll just get you to kind of bring up your notes again from our past lesson 2 about the Saints and the Roughnecks. And we'll talk a little bit about how it connects to labeling theory. So it connects to labeling theory because in this small town, the good group, the Saints, and the bad group, the Roughnecks, were pretty much doing the same stuff. They were teenagers, underage drinking, running around, kind of getting into trouble. They were both doing that. But since the Saints were perceived, they were labeled as the good kids coming from a good family, like it couldn't be them. And then on the other side of that, the Roughnecks, who might have come from different rougher areas, their families might not have been quite as well known in the community. They were just automatically labeled as bad. And then always having that label thrust upon them made them only see themselves as bad and then continue to act out that way. So just to refresh a little bit about what we talked about the first 2 lessons, I think Banksy, most folks have heard about him, is a good example of interesting purposes of deviance. So as you can see here, we have a few examples of this art. Um, in most places is illegal, so that's definitely a deviant act and a crime. At the same time, the idea is to kind of protest what are considered social norms. So you can see on the right here, you have a gentleman who looks like he's dressed in like kind of protest riot gear, but he's about to throw flowers, which is kind of a symbol of peace and love. So this is an interesting way to deviate from social norms and express yourself. I continue on with theory now. So modeling theory is the first one we'll get into today. It's when individuals learn deviant behavior by observing commit deviant acts. The theory suggests that people will model deviant behavior based on what they see in the news, movies, video games, etc. So I think a good way to remember this is just remembering really what the word modeling means. It's kind of self-explanatory in that way. But as a society, we often become desensitized to violence because we see it so often, especially in popular culture. This is when people do not react to violence or crime with anger or disgust. It's just kind of something that they think is normal. It's part of everyday life. Modeling theory can also suggest that observing deviant behavior can produce copycats, and copycats will reenact the behavior that they see. So an example that you might have heard of in CSI or Criminal Minds, whatever it is that you watch, are copycat killers. So they're kind of striving to achieve that type of infamy, to be famous and to be revered as this kind of famous figure. So they copy what they've seen other folks do. So other types of crime, they copy that. So that's an example of modeling theory. But this one is quite the mouthful. So differential association theory, which means that people are likely to behave in a deviant way when deviant behavior is defined as normal and acceptable. This behavior is reinforced by others who also validate it as okay. So through interaction, individuals can deem deviant behavior as acceptable routine. And I have like kind of a gangster mobster picture down here. Um, because I think that's a good example because all these folks who are constantly around each other, a lot of them are probably related. Crime might be a big part of who they are, like their identity. So they don't really see it as deviant because it might have been all they've ever known. Whereas maybe going to volunteer at a cat shelter might be considered deviant for these folks because it's outside of their own norms. So we'll just get you to take a look at this link here. It's again in the unit plan. It kind of gives a good recap of all the terms that we've talked about in kind of a fun and refreshing way that isn't just me talking at you. And then I'll just get you to kind of reflect on your notes so far. We've talked a lot about different theories that can kind of be dense and hard to digest. So here are some reminders of what we've already talked about. This would be where I ask you to ask me questions about what it is that you're not quite understanding, or what it is that you really do find interesting, or is this an example of this, that kind of thing. So maybe just take a look at your notes and reflect on that and see if there's something else that you might want a little bit of extra help with. Unfortunately, I can't be interactive right now, but you could always Google it, email me, that kind of thing. So then we'll move on to our next lesson here. So if you're only sticking around for the theory lesson, it was nice to see you. Goodbye. But if you're still sticking around, we're going to move on to the Milgram experiment, which is a really exciting lesson. So the Milgram experiment was first conducted in 1965 by a Yale researcher whose name was Stanley Milgram, as you can see where the name probably comes from. So there was a learner and a teacher in each experiment. So the learner was somebody who was planted there by the researcher. So they were an actor. So that's important to remember. They knew what was going on in the experiment. They weren't actually being hurt, and we'll get to that later. So the teacher, so this is a person that was brought in who didn't know the true purpose behind the experiment. They thought that they were administering real and painful shocks to the learner every time they got an answer to the memorization test wrong. So just to kind of put this in a little bit, excuse me, easier terms to understand, and you will watch the experiment pretty much in full, and that will explain it as well. But you have the teacher who is asking the learner, who is the actor, questions, and the learner is answering wrong just to see what the teacher will do. But every time the learner answers wrong, the teacher shocks them. And the test was to see how far people would go, all the way to administering fatal shocks to people that they didn't even know just because an authority or somebody in a lab coat told them to. So that was the idea of the experiment, was to kind of research what the how authority plays into conforming, when everyday folks who probably wouldn't do this normally, what they would do under authority. So maybe just write these down before you watch the experiment, your answers to these questions. So what percentage of people do you think administered what could have been considered a fatal shock at 450 volts of electricity? And then think of how this experiment demonstrates conformity. And then you can watch the experiment at this link here, which is included in the lesson plan. And just keep that in mind. Some of this is really interesting. Only go up to 1915, because after that it tapers off from the experiment. But you might find some really interesting and shocking, no pun intended, results here. That was the end of that lesson, just because the video is about 35 minutes long, or no, it's about 19 minutes long, sorry. The full video is about half an hour. So we'll move on to our next lesson, which is about the police, courts, and prisons. And we're kind of the evolution of corrections and how it's changed. So the legal system that we have now is quite different from what it once looked like. The methods that the police, courts, and prisons have used to exert social control has always been shifting. So we're going to take a quick look at the evolution of the correctional system in Canada. So crime and punishment. So in the early years, those who broke laws were often severely punished, and often in a public nature. People were whipped or branded, and that's kind of when you have like a stick with a really hot piece of metal and maybe sometimes a specific symbol, and they just place it on your skin and it burns that symbol into you, so you're branded in a way. And they would also sometimes place people who committed crimes were sometimes placed in wooden structures called pillories. Their arms and heads were restricted, and they were made to stand out in the public for hours on end, as you can see in the photo attached here. And then 1835 was a really transformative year for the Canadian correction system. That's when the Kingston Penitentiary opened. And then in 2013, that's when it finally closed, and it was infamously known as Canada's toughest and most notorious prison. Conditions were horrendous. Inmates were not allowed to speak or even look at one another. Their meals often only consisted of bread and water, and their cells were very small in size. So what we'll do here is watch a documentary. It's a CBC doc about the Kingston Penitentiary and how things have kind of changed. And I will warn you that there is some strong language and some violence and graphic imagery in this doc, but it's a really interesting look into the history of Canada's corrections, and a really interesting look into what this prison was like. It interviews some inmates, some correctional officers, so it's definitely worth the watch. So that's where we will end this lesson, because this is a fairly long documentary. So this is attached in the unit plan, so I'll get you to take a look at that. And then we'll answer some questions. Put down some notes as well of what you see, things that shock you, things that interest you, things you've noticed have changed, things you noticed that haven't changed. Just write down your observations and what you think. So we'll start the next lesson here, and we'll start that by looping back to the film Secrets from Canada's most famous prison, the Kingston Penitentiary. What surprised or shocked you? What has changed? What hasn't changed? So on my left here is a photo of the Kingston Penitentiary just before it closed. And then this here is a photo from a current prison. So you might have seen a lot of shocking things in the documentary. I found rioted, and a gentleman broke the bell just because it was a constant example of how they were controlled. They ring the dinner bell, and it just kind of got into his brain as something that was so controlling and isolating that he smashed it. He was super excited to have smashed it. So that was super symbolic in a way. But maybe just go through your notes again and think about what's shocking and what's changed from what you understand now. Maybe you don't know a whole lot about the current correction system in Canada, and that's okay, because we're going to get into that. So we talked about the past, which is punishment, pain, crime, punishment, that type of thing. Corrections were in the form of public punishment or torture. You can see the pillories here again on the left. But this was later followed by incarceration, and inmates were often faced with inhumane living conditions. Now, um, things have changed, but not a whole lot, because incarceration is still a pretty big piece of the Canadian correction system. And in terms of conditions, just over a year ago, inmates at the Burnside Jail went on a 21-day strike. They called for better health care, better rehabilitation programs, and an end to racial profiling in corrections, healthier food, air conditioning or heating, depending on the season, of course, and better access to library services. So for those who don't know, Burnside Jail is in Nova Scotia. So these are all demands from Nova Scotian inmates. And I think a lot of these demands seem pretty fair, and they kind of go back to what folks who attended the Kingston Penitentiary had issues with. And we're in really interesting times right now. The reason I'm recording this online is because of COVID. We are in the middle of a pandemic. So we're all expected, to be responsible citizens, socially distance ourselves from one another. But I think a good question is, how can that possibly be done in a prison? There's hundreds, sometimes thousands of folks in there. They share the same bathrooms. Some share the same cells, rec rooms, cafeteria, workplaces, the whole shebang. So a lot of health officials, journalists, and activists are calling for the release of nonviolent offenders from incarceration to lessen the deadly spread of coronavirus. Health officials have said that prisons are like an epicenter. They're like a petri dish almost for the spread of this illness, just because of the proximity and people using the same utensils, the same services, the same areas. It's impossible to socially distance. So what are your thoughts on this? Like, what do you think about that? Do you think that's a good idea, a bad idea? Do you understand why people are calling for this? Do you not understand why people are calling for this? I just think it's a really interesting piece uh, of corrections and of incarceration, especially. It's so unprecedented, right? Like in the middle of a pandemic, and these folks, you're supposed to be 2 meters, 6 feet for those in the imperial system, away from each other, right? So it's virtually impossible in a prison. So that's just an interesting discussion piece to think about. And we also, I think it's important for us to um, investigate and acknowledge that crime does affect us differently, but how? So I've got some statistics that I put together here. Some are specific to Halifax, some are specific to Toronto, and some to Canada as a whole, from what I found. So here's one. Black people in Halifax were 6 times more likely to be stopped by police for a street check than white people. Street checks are now illegal. So basically what that meant was, if you were walking down the street and police officer wanted to stop you to ask for your ID, they could do that with no cause, no probable reasoning. Can't do that anymore, but there are different ways that you can kind of get through a loophole to stop folks for no reason. But that's something interesting to keep in mind. As well, Indigenous peoples are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. This is a really shocking statistic, I think. They make up 4% of the general population, but about 25% of the prison population. And this isn't because they're committing more crime. That the math also just wouldn't check out then. And we hear in the news too about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and how crime affects them differently. And there's a whole slew of reasons for that. But that's another important thing to keep in mind. And then this is specific to Toronto. Black Toronto residents are 20 times more likely to die in a police interaction than white Toronto residents. And low-income people are more likely to be arrested and more likely to be denied bail than high-income individuals. So I found a lot of these statistics really shocking but interesting, I think really important to keep in mind when we're talking about deviance and when we're talking about crime is that the system affects us all differently, and it's not proportionately representative of uh, everybody. It's not diverse, but diverse in the wrong ways, I should say. We've talked about the past, we've talked about the present. What about the future? So do you see the current prison system as effective? Maybe you do. But if not, what do you think should change? So you can't get in small groups, but maybe you can with your family. Do some research on the effectiveness of Canada's current prison system. What are some alternative methods? So be prepared to show the class a short presentation detailing what you've come up with. Be specific and be creative with your ideas. So I've got a rubric attached to the unit plan in terms of what I'd be looking for. If you really are not sure where to start, that's okay. You can try by researching restorative justice in Canada, periodic detention, or even simply Googling alternative approaches to incarceration. You might find a lot of interesting things you never heard of that you might think could be effective. You might think they couldn't at all, but I want to hear why. So that's what the assignment is for this bit here. The end of that lesson, and if that's all you're tuning in for, that's okay. We're going to move on. So we've talked a lot about, theories that surround crime, corrections in Canada, what that has looked like, what that looks like now, what it might look like in the future, formal and informal sanctions. So what about the sociological explanations as to why people commit crime? So knowing what you already know about deviance, what do you think? What are some social factors that you think could contribute to this? You to write it out and get in groups. Write down some reasons you can think of why people might turn to crime. Do you think different areas have the same rate of crime? So a rural and an urban area, Halifax and Wolfville, why or why not? We'll come back as a class in 15 minutes and compile our own class list. And once we've done that, we'll investigate what crime actually looks like in Canada. So I want you to check out the interactive dashboard on Statistics Canada, specifically about crime and justice, where you can find here. You can write. I want you to write down 5 statistics that you found interesting. And I think the purpose of this it's quite helpful because it gives you a more realistic view of crime. Because I think a lot of our knowledge, and myself included, a lot of our knowledge on crime comes from like television and movies, and that can be really inaccurate and kind of biased and misleading. So I think it's important for us to check out real concrete facts, which you can find here. And that's the end of that lesson, just because there's a lot on the interactive dashboard that I think is worth checking out. So that would have taken a good chunk of a regular lesson. So we'll move on to youth crime and violence. So what do you already know about youth crime? Do you know how it differs from ways in which the Canadian correction system deals with adult crime? If not, that's okay, because we'll get into it, but maybe just kind of reflect back on that for a bit. What you already know, maybe what you've heard about in the news, maybe what you know personally. We'll just kind of think for a second about how it might be different or just general things that you might know about. We'll get a little bit into the history. So there's been different laws that help to deal with youth crime. So for example, this is a really long, this set of laws was in place for a really long time. 1908 to 1984 was the Juvenile Delinquents Act. And just imagine how much of society has changed in between 1908 and 1984. And they were using the exact same laws. So that, as you can imagine, that would probably bring up some issues. And then the Young Offenders Act in 1984 to 2003. And then 2003 to present, we have the Youth Criminal Justice Act, also known as the YCJA. So Canada approaches youth crime differently than we approach adult crime, which you might have reflected on when I asked you at the beginning what it is that you know about youth crime. So in Canada, youths are considered individuals who are aged from 12 to 17, and the purpose of the Youth Criminal Justice Act is to acknowledge that youth must be held accountable for their actions, but that they have a greater chance at successful rehabilitation than adults. So this photo on the right here, I don't know if you can tell or if any of you folks have seen it. This is from a show called Beyond Scared Straight. And that they have I think it's mostly in the States, but I'm sure we have similar stuff to it here in Canada, where they bring young folks who have struggled with crime and have run into the criminal justice system into adult prisons and kind of get the prisoners to scare them, and they do like different workshops and things like that, in hopes to deter these youth from committing crime and actually ending up in an adult prison in their future life. Look at the Youth Criminal Justice Act through this video that is attached to the unit plan as well. So just keep in mind what your thoughts are about it. What does youth court and sentencing look like? This is a short video, but it's got a lot of different facts. It's very quick. What differences do you notice from adult court and sentencing? So just keep that in mind. Then another discussion point is, why do youth commit crime? What do you think? Why do you think youth commit crime? I think this is an interesting concept to ponder. It is a really complex issue, as you can imagine. Some youth are faced with obstacles that produce barriers which do not allow them to successfully transition into adulthood. So that can be a reason for committing crime. Youth who come from lower income families, are in foster care, are surrounded by violence, or have little structure in their family are more likely to become offenders. So I think this is important to remember. The purpose of the Youth Criminal Justice Act is that it's designed so that youth who don't have all the tools that they need to succeed can have a second chance. And we're going to talk about how to get those tools. So what do you think? What can you do to disrupt youth crime? What kind of things are there out there? We talked about Beyond Scared Straight, but there are some kind of less confrontational, I guess, programs. So what have you heard about? Maybe just pause and think on that, and maybe do some research. Just think about community-based projects that you've heard about yourself. Some that I know for personally are Schools Plus. So that's province-wide. And Schools Plus, it has offices in different schools around the province, and they're kind of like places that you can hang out. You can talk to a support worker. You can talk to other folks who work with the organization there. They can help you get resources if you need them. One that I participated in when I was in high school is called Pathways to Education. Unfortunately, this is only in Spryfield, which is just outside of Halifax. And basically, they are very similar to Schools Plus, but they have like incentive-based programs. So you have access to a tutor in a safe space twice a week. You have access to school supplies and textbooks. And then when you attend those tutoring sessions twice a week, you have access to perhaps like a bus pass or a gift card for groceries or fees for a sports team. They have all kinds of different types of resources and incentives to help students. And then Jumpstart, maybe you've heard of Jumpstart. It's associated with Canadian Tire, but it helps to fund youth who can't afford to be in organized sport. So it could help you pay for your registration for a hockey team, or help for a camp, a sports camp, that kind of thing. So now what we're going to do as an activity is that you're going to pretend that you are the person in charge of making a crime prevention program that's targeted specifically at youth. And what would you do? So in small groups, write a brief plan of the kinds of programs you would create to deter youth crime. And again, if you're not sure where to start, try researching already existing approaches to deterring youth crime, like the programs that we just talked about today. So this is the end of the unit. I definitely need a drink of water. I probably should have spliced the lessons up a little bit. But at this point, we would do a test. Some important terms to remember are deviance, obviously, a deviant, conformity, formal and informal sanctions, anomie, labeling theory, differential association theory, the Milgram experiment, corrections in Canada, youth crime, and more. So check out the review sheet that I passed out in class, but is also attached to the unit plan that I have on my website. And the test is also there, so if you wanted to quiz yourself and kind of see how you can reflect back on what you've already learned, that's an option for you as well. But besides that, that is Unit 5, Social Control, Deviant and Conformist Behavior with Miss Winters. my website if you want my contact info for any questions or any other resources. I also have Indigenous lessons on there. So some lessons that I did for my Indigenous education course, which are treaty infused. So that means that they're have Indigenous ways of knowing in there. Mi'kmaq words, there's 3 Mi'kmaq words in every lesson. Some resources that are really great on a whole bunch of different social study issues. So I really suggest checking that out as well. But you have access to my contact info and resources on my website. So